Eric, welcome to the Lead, Learn, Grow podcast. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, Robin, thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to catch up with you. As I read in the bio, folks around Richmond who even loosely keep up with things through the newspaper, it seems like half the articles that I read these days are written by you, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I know you're busy, and I really appreciate you coming on. So let's start here. Go back to Eric Kolenich, 18 years old, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. And if someone would have said, "Hey, Eric, what do you want to be when you grow up?" What would you have said?
At 18, I would have said, I have no idea. I didn't even know what I wanted to major in when I graduated high school. I knew that I wasn't particularly good at math or science. And then as a freshman, English was my best class. And so I made the prudent decision to major in English. I don't know if I would do that again. I considered a philosophy minor. So again, not really making steps toward a career with those decisions.
Yes.
I ended up not doing the philosophy minor, but I did stick with the English major. And then it was around my junior year of college that I thought I was working for the student paper, and I thought, well, if I enjoy doing this and I'm not getting paid, maybe I should try doing it and getting paid. I applied to all these internships at newspapers that were super competitive, and I didn't get any of them. And so I said, screw that. And I went to work for the FBI for 6 months. I got a job with the FBI outside Washington, D.C. I worked there for a few months and I really hated it. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm 22. There's no better time to like blow up my career path than at age 22. And I got a part-time job at the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I moved back in with my parents. And I was part-time for 2.5 years before I became full-time. And I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, that's incredible. So so what were you doing with the FBI? Like, what does an English major do with the FBI?
Yeah, so I thought I would get a writing job because they kind of said, well, whatever your major is, we can find something that, we can apply your education to something in the FBI. And it ended up being a lot more of databases. The FBI keeps a whole lot of different databases, and it was a lot more of diving into those sorts of things. And I didn't really get to do a whole lot of writing. And I didn't get to scratch that creative itch. I wanted to do something that was creative and producing something that had a little bit of me in it, and I didn't really get to do that there.
Yeah, so I want to ask you, and we'll get into some more tactical, practical kinds of things, but I'm curious about how do you stay resilient uh, in an industry that is changing as much as it is? I'm fascinated to hear, how someone from inside the newspaper business sees the newspaper business, and how do you stay focused on learning and growing and developing and carving out a career when there's so much change? Because if you think about it, it's almost like what business owners face. Like there's always chaos going on around them. How do you stay kind of focused on the right track?
Yeah, that's a great question. And through the years, I've asked older reporters that. And my answer to that is I try to put blinders on to the realities of the newspaper business, and I try to think about it as little as possible. That doesn't mean I don't think about it. That doesn't mean that I ignore the realities. I just try to keep them, in a small corner of my brain and not at the forefront. And I try to think more about the work that I'm doing, because the work that I'm doing is really satisfying. So if I can think about the stories that I'm writing, the topics that I want to pursue, the people that need to be in the newspaper, the issues that are going on, in the Richmond area, those are the things that like motivate me and inspire me and keep me going. And if I can focus on that and think less about the troubles facing the Times-Dispatch, facing the newspaper industry, I can stay positive. It's always like a battle, though. I mean, it's hard to, put the financial troubles of the newspaper industry out of my mind. I try not to think about it. But I try to focus on the work that I'm actually doing. And if I can do that, I can stay motivated.
Yeah. How do you decide? like, so you're a storyteller, right? So you're telling stories, and you know, as you've mentioned, it's certainly a creative endeavor if there ever was one. Um, how do you how do you observe your environment to find the most compelling stories? Like, how do you decide what to do and then what angles to take? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so this is definitely something that you get better at as you get older, the more experience you have, because you're looking for something that's new or different or unique or something I've never heard of before, or a trend that seems to be affecting a lot of people. And when you're brand new and young, you don't necessarily know what's new and what's different, and that's a little harder to gauge. The older you get, kind of the more keen you can get on these sort of things. You can kind of pinpoint these things a little bit better. So when you boil down a story, is it business as usual? Is it companies behaving as they're supposed to? Is it university leaders or political leaders doing their normal job, or is this out of the normal course of business? Is this something a little bit different? And that's what I'm looking for, something a little bit different or unique. And I want something specific,
Mm.
out of a big trend or a big topic. Uh, I want either a person or a group. If we're talking about, housing prices going up, I want to find that person who, how has that person been affected, by their mortgage going up, or their taxes, or, who's the person who, had to move or can't afford the house that they wanted. How can I, there's a saying in journalism, use the small to tell the story of the large, so like find that individual person that tells the bigger story of, how housing prices have gone through the roof. Because if you can get it down to a certain person's story, that's far more memorable. If you can tell an individual story, that is what kind of resonates with people more than just, hey, there's a housing crisis. Mortgage rates, interest rates are up, and fewer people can afford houses. If you can personalize that, that makes for a much better story.
Yeah, I remember reading, I think it was Charlie Munger who said people forget the data, but they always remember the story. And I think
Yeah.
even in the business literature, things like Harvard Business Review and the business podcasts that are out there, I feel like it's a heightened um, emphasis on the art of storytelling, which is part of why I wanted to have you on as someone who tells stories for a living. What are what are some of the challenges around telling complex stories? Like, what are some of the roadblocks that you commonly um, run into as you're crafting stories, if that even makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is understanding everything you're writing about. And as journalists, you kind of have to become an expert on one small topic for a short period of time, and then you move on to something else and you try to become an expert on that, and then you try to become an expert on something else. And every story you're doing, you're trying to find out as much as you can about that topic. And when you don't really know what you're writing about, that kind of comes through in a story. I can look back on my stories and I can tell which ones I really knew the material and which ones I kind of understood it. I had a vague grasp on it. That's a big thing. And then clarity, being able to like explain this stuff, in a clear way, is always a big challenge. How do I get the reader to understand what I'm trying to explain to them? How do I get from A to B to C? I think those are two of the big things.
So just in the weeds here, and then I want to shift gears a little bit, but so do you have, like, I envision in my mind, like you would have a process. So it's like, okay, I have an idea. So first I'm going to do this. And, it's like, I'm in high school English class and they say, hey, if you're going to write a term paper, use index cards and then move them around. And like, what's your process for actually drafting and writing a compelling story?
Yeah, so usually I have probably one Word document for notes. And then I've got my story either, I'm writing it either in a separate Word document or directly into our system. And so I've got those side by side, on my screen. I just write on a laptop. I don't have two monitors or anything like that. So I've got everything pretty condensed and pretty like tightly squeezed into my screen. And then so depending on the size of the story, if it's a large story, I might have dozens of pages of notes, depending on where I'm getting my information, or if I've got documents that I've obtained in like a Freedom of Information Act request or something like that. I might have those off to the side too, and those could be very long. And then so usually what I do is I come up with the idea. What is this story about? I've heard it called the WIDA. What is this about? What is this about? And I try to sum that up. And lots of times I type that at the top of my story. And it should just be a few words, less than 10 probably. And, it needs to have a verb in it usually. And so like one story I wrote recently, it was about VCU administrators arguing over the Clay Street development deal before the deal collapsed. And so I think I probably wrote something like VCU administrators, argued over doomed deal, something like that. And then the headline ends up becoming something close to that, but not necessarily that. The WIDA is something that I'm thinking about just for me. It's not the headline, but the headline will be similar to it. And that's driving my story. So everything needs to fall under that WIDA. Everything needs to support what is this about, and that focus or that goal. And if a sentence or a paragraph does not support what I've said this story is about, it should come out. So usually in the first few paragraphs, I'm trying to capture the whole story. So if it's a long story, it might be 10 paragraphs. If it's a short story, it might be 3 paragraphs. But I want the gist of everything in the first few paragraphs, because if I've got something really good and I save it for the last 25% of the story, the reader may never get to it. So if I've got something good, if I've got something that helps explain it, I want that in the first few paragraphs. And so I'm trying to get everything important mentioned in the first few paragraphs. And then usually around the end of this intro, I have reporters call it the nut graph. Or if it's just, or it could be several paragraphs, it could just be, they call it the nut. Boil this story down into a few sentences. I usually want that in my story, and I'm usually trying to identify that. Not every story needs to have it. There are stories that are great that don't have them, but usually my approach, I'm trying to do that. And so the first few paragraphs of my story should sum up everything that I'm going to talk about. And then I'm kind of re-explaining it in detail farther down. And then I have to decide, is this story going to be done chronologically, or is it just, here's subject 1 and then subject 2 and then subject 3? Is there some other way I should be approaching this story? I will think about that. Lots of times stories are chronological. Lots of times it's just, here's the most important point. Here's the second most important point. Here's the third most important point. And so usually I start by writing section headers, and, I'll put those in brackets, and I'll say, here are the things that I want to accomplish in this section. And I will write down all the section headers that this story will have. And maybe, if it's a short story, maybe it's got 2 or 3, or if it's a long story, maybe it's got 8 or 10. And then I go back through my notes, and I usually go through my notes just top to bottom. And when I see something that I know needs to go into my story, I figure out, okay, what part of what section header does that go under? And I put it down, and maybe it's a note, maybe it's a full sentence, maybe it's a statistic. And I kind of start assembling the story like that. And so I kind of think of my stories as like paint by numbers, because the first thing I'm doing is I'm drawing out like the big picture, what's it going to look like? And then I'm kind of going into each little square and I'm filling it in with color. And then so I'm going through my notes and then kind of filling in each part of the story. So I'm not writing top to bottom. I might write the bottom, and then I might write the middle, and then I might write the top, and then I'm jumping all around. And then the last thing I will do is kind of go through the whole thing and try to smooth it out, like kind of just ironing out all the wrinkles in the sheets, and making sure the story fits together, and that the sentences flow, and that the paragraphs flow. And sometimes if I didn't really understand the story at the beginning, that might mean rewriting most of the story. That's not always the case. Lots of times it's not. But the last thing I'm doing is kind of going top to bottom and making sure the story works the way the reader's going to read it.
Wow, that's a master class. That's awesome. Thank you for that. So I, you write about, so like the one you brought up, like the whole VCU thing would be an example. Like you're a Richmond guy, like you live here, you work here. Like there's a part of me, it's almost like I think the thing that keeps entrepreneurs and business owners and uh, people from putting themselves out there is because of potential criticism. Either people don't like your work, they don't like that you, in your case, that you decided to write about it for the world to see. But I think in the business world, it's, well, what if my ideas get rejected? What if my long form post on LinkedIn? What if my blog post? What if my video, people, reject it, or it's not good enough? Like, how do you think about the criticism and feedback? Because I think for a lot of people, it probably keeps them from, shipping, actually putting stuff out there. You ever think about that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, first of all, I try to read all the comments, all the comments on the story, or I'll go on Facebook and see what kind of comments. And lots of times people will criticize the subject matter of the story and the people I'm writing about, and then sometimes they'll criticize me. They'll say, the author didn't get this, or this should have been in the story. And I think about those things. And sometimes there are valid criticisms there. Sometimes there are things that's like, yeah, like maybe the story could have addressed this. And I mean, if you're going to be a reporter, you have to be thick-skinned, because you're always going to get complaints. That's part of the business. And so I do try to think about, like, I try to take criticism to heart and think like, okay, is that is there something valid here, and move on. If if I think like, if I can do that story better the next time, the next time I'm writing something, I try to keep that in the back of my mind. Like, how can I improve for next time?
Well, it's a very self-actualized approach for a non-philosophy major. I'm impressed. That's hard to do. It's like I thought you were going to say, I never look at the comments. I can't, but you're like, yeah, let's lean into it, and that's impressive.
Yeah, lots of times people want stories to be other things than they are, and there's not much I can do about that.
Yeah.
I chose to write about this, and I did the best I could with that topic. And some people want, well, the story should have gone in this direction, or should have addressed that, and there's not much I can do there. But I want to know what people are saying. I want to know how they're reacting. Because that also helps me gauge, you know, how did people see this story? Because they may have seen it differently than I did. And they might focus in on one paragraph or one sentence, and bring up points to this, and they might think of something that I didn't think of, and okay, oh, that was an important point, maybe that should have been higher in the story, or maybe that is a question I should be asking for another story, or something like that. I want to know, like, how people are reacting to these stories, because I mean, they are for the readers.
Yeah, and it's feedback. I mean, it makes sense when you emotionally detach from it. It's feedback. What resonates, what doesn't, but hard to do. So that's awesome. One more thing, and then I'm going to shift gears. What are some of the favorite stories? Like I would imagine writers would have, like, these were some of my favorite topics or favorite stories that I enjoyed doing. What are some that come to your mind, and not so much around the topic, because I know you've written about things that aren't happy, but you might have been proud of the story and proud of how it came out. Any things come to mind around that?
Yeah, two big ones. a story that I wrote. I'm not even sure what year it was now. I think maybe 2016. It was several years ago when I was in the sports section. I followed around a high school soccer player who was in recovery from drug addiction. And he played for the Godwin soccer team, but he was actually taking his classes at the rehab center at McShin in Henrico County.
Hmm.
And they had never done this before. He was the first student they did it with, where if you're sick or something, the schools, they can send your work, home with you or something like that. And so he had this arrangement where his work would be kind of sent to the rehab facility, and he would do his work there, and then he would go play on the soccer team at Godwin after school. And he had an opioid addiction, and among other things, and he was in recovery. And someone had mentioned to me that there was someone on the Godwin soccer team who was taking classes elsewhere and was in opioid addiction recovery. And I went to the coach and I said, hey, any chance this person would be interested in talking to me? And the coach talked to the student, and he was like, yeah, he was okay with that. I think he saw it as a part of his recovery, just the idea of being transparent about who he was. And so I actually, I went to his home and talked to his parents. I went to Godwin soccer practices and soccer games, and I probably followed him around. I went to his high school graduation. I probably followed him around for 3 months plus, and wrote a really long story, probably one of the longest I've ever done, that ran like that summer. And it got a lot of attention, and it was pretty meaningful. I think it was a meaningful story, and that one really sticks out in my memory as one of the ones that meant a lot to me too. His name is Andrew Nelson, and he was an amazing person to write about, because he not only did he was he okay with me like asking him questions, but he was very forthright in everything about the struggles in his life. And just the way he would phrase things. Sometimes he would say things and I would think, man, like I can't write it better than you just said it. And I would think like, I think I told him like, hey, if you ever want to write a book about your life, like you've got the talent to do it. I feel like, because just the way he saw things and the way he said things, I thought like, yeah, the way he just said it, that's the way it's going to be in the article, because I can't write it better than he just said it. And so he was really an amazing person, to write about and to capture. And the second one, so another story that I've written about a whole lot was the death of Adam Oakes. He was a VCU student who passed away in 2021 in a university hazing incident. And basically, for more than 2 years, I've written dozens of stories about him, and I've gotten to know his family, and probably the story out of all of those that resonates the most was, I uncovered kind of the story of his fraternity, which a lot of people didn't know. I mean, even Adam's family, they said, there was no way he knew what he was getting into with this fraternity. And it turns out the fraternity had, a long list of problems before Adam died. So what I had done for that story was I made a Freedom of Information request to VCU for lots of basically communication emails between the university and the fraternity over a span of, I think, close to 10 years. And it turns out that the fraternity had been suspended multiple times. The university was actually going to suspend them for 4 years, and then they relented and reduced the suspension to 1 year. And had the suspension stayed for 4 years, Adam Oakes never would have joined the fraternity, because they still would have been suspended at that time. And so it turned out that Adam Oakes' death was just kind of the culmination of a lot of problems that this fraternity had. And that story, I think it kind of it kind of, it took the tragedy of Adam Oakes's death, and it just kind of, I felt like it kind of opened a window into the university fraternity culture, this particular fraternity, and it kind of, it put his death in context of what was happening in this fraternity for years, and how the university in some cases had tried to stop the fraternity, to try to rehabilitate them, and failed to do so. And I thought it really explained kind of the backstory, as to what happened. And that's something journalists like to do a lot, is if we can explain how something came to be, what were the factors that caused this to happen, that's something, we try to do a lot.
And I'm guessing like the feeling of being able to really make a difference. I mean, that must be like the ultimate in what you do.
Yeah, I mean, that's the hope. I mean, the hope is that stories that we write, that they will connect with someone and, improve their lives, or open them up to something that they didn't know that helps them in some way. I would like to think, like the story on Andrew Nelson, I would like to think that maybe there was someone out there who has battled drug addiction who read that story and went, wow, if this guy can do it, so can I. That's the hope, is that we're reaching people in some kind of positive way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And if I went to Google Andrew and the Adam Oakes story, like the links are still live, right?
Yeah, the links are live. I mean, the way Google and SEO searches work, sometimes it's hard to find stories, once they get to be old.
Yeah.
With Adam Oakes, there have been hundreds of stories written by lots of different publications. So yeah, they can be hard to find sometimes, but yeah, they're still out there.
Yeah, if I can find them to the audience, I'll put them in the show notes.
I can send them to you.
Okay, yeah, send them to me, Eric, and I'll make sure to include them. Um, so maybe shifting, I want to be mindful of time. So let's pretend you were hired to coach an executive, and the executive wanted to be a better writer. They wanted to be better at um, communicating with their team or with the world at large. And you said, you know what, Eric, you're a professional. Can you help me be a better communicator? What are some things you would talk about? Where would you start? How would you even think about that?
Yeah, so a lot of writing in journalism is transferable to writing, in any industry, because every industry, there are messages we're trying to get across to people. And the goal is, how do we efficiently convey that information to them in a way that they understand it? So like I was talking about the widow, what is this about? I mean, that can be applied to, any writing in the business world. What message am I trying to get out to the public? What message am I trying to get out to my employees? How do I boil that down to what do I want to say? And then how do I make sure that everything flows from that? Clarity is very important. One thing I would say, it's really important to write with active voice. It's not, try to avoid things like, tuition was raised, at VCU on Thursday, and write in active voice. The Board of Visitors approved a tuition hike on Thursday. That kind of stuff, conveys a lot more information. There are a lot of little things that you can go through, and you can kind of, you can shape an article or a story or paragraphs to make them better. But just thinking about, like, getting from sentence to sentence and paragraph to paragraph so that everything makes sense, in a clear way, I think is the most important thing. And making sure, you've thought about that. What is it that I'm trying to convey? And like, is my message like concise? When I talk about like the widow, what is this about? Like, have you come up with a concise topic for whatever you're writing about? Or, is it vague, or does it go down a lot of different pathways? The first thing is deciding what you're writing about, and like, do you have a concise, clear topic?
Hmm.
for what you're writing about, and then does everything follow beneath it? I think those are some of the most important things.
Yeah, that do you find that do you have any thoughts on how it's different, like writing on digital platforms? Like, is that a different kind of writing, or does it? Because I think about like scrollers, right? So we look at our phone, we just kind of scroll, scroll, scroll. Are there any tip? Like, would you write something differently if it were just digital um, versus the traditional way? Any thoughts on
No,
that?
so like I don't have like a different approach for an article that's going to be online versus an article that's going to be in the paper. Everything we write is in both, and they don't need to be different.
Right.
That said, like newsletters, a newsletter, you can take a more conversational tone. If what you're going to be writing is going to be read on the radio, it's going to be more conversational. If it's going to be on TV, it's going to have a little bit of a different approach. Like, there are, you can kind of, add in some things in broadcast, like, do you remember that time when, and in phrases like that, we probably would skip that in an article just to get straight to the point. Because we want to use fewer words. Sometimes, things that are broadcast, you can use a few more words to be a little bit more conversational. Axios right now, that's a news outlet that their articles are basically bullet points. It's not that different of an approach from what I do, in that they try to get the majority of the topic in the first couple paragraphs, and then it's bullet points below that. That's not a bad approach to study for businesses. And Axios, they sell that model to businesses. You can buy like how to write. They call it smart brevity. It's the smart brevity model.
Mm-hmm.
And that applies to businesses too. So like different platforms can have some different styles to it, but a news article, basically, the articles that I'm writing, it's not going to be different between print and digital, but if I'm writing a sports story, I've got a little bit more leeway to have a little bit more fun with it, or to be a little bit more artsy. If I'm writing a feature story, about someone's life, I might be a little bit more flowery in my language. If I'm writing about mortgages, I might be a little bit more straightforward. The more complicated the topic, the more straightforward I might try to be. So there are different approaches based on the kind of story I'm writing,
Mm-hmm.
and where it's going.
So, a couple more questions and we'll wrap up. Who are some of your favorite writers? Like, do you have like journalists that you admire and look up to, or even just writers of, other types of, books or whatever it may be?
Yeah, Eli Saslow of the New York Times. He was with the Washington Post for decades, but he's for a long time, and now he's at the New York Times. He's really great. I mean, what he basically does is he will write a story about a person or a group of people, that tries to explain something, in our culture. So like, to write about homelessness, he went to, I don't remember what city it was. He went to a restaurant that, right outside there was a number of homeless people who were often outside the building. And it was the challenges that the restaurant owner, had to deal with homeless people,
Mm,
near his restaurant, and the challenges that the homeless people had to deal with. Or
mm,
like, for a story about evictions, he followed around an officer whose job it was to actually conduct the evictions, and usually, and I said earlier, use the small to tell the story of the large. That's exactly what he does, is that he will write about this one person or this one family, and usually there's some insight that can be gleaned from it. And that's really good. I like Jeff Pearlman a lot. He's a sports reporter. He writes books. He was with Sports Illustrated, and now he writes books. His language is very colorful. Just he does a great job like painting pictures, and just the words that he uses. It's really beautiful. Those are two just off the top of my head
Yeah.
that I'm a big fan of. And
No,
I
I think,
still, I was in the sports section for 10 years, so I still love reading sports journalism. And so they're probably, still a lot of my favorites. Dave Sheinin of the Washington Post is another. For years I would try to write sentences like his. Just the way he like paints a picture of like like in a baseball stadium, the bullpen door, swinging open, and the relief pitcher, emerging from the outfield and running down the outfield and, taking the mound and warming up. Just the way he's able to like paint that picture was always amazing to me. And so, yeah, he's another one that I've always appreciated.
yeah, it's really interesting what I don't know if you subscribe to The Athletic, but like sort of the twist that The Athletic, for folks who aren't aware, is like a subscription service. I think the New York Times now owns the company, but it's taken these, I like Trent Rosencrans and guys like that who were like beat writers for sports teams or in cities, and it's really almost given them carte blanche, like write what you want. And so it's not like, the Reds bullpen blew the lead and like it's not that kind of writing. It's more about people and it's really fun. It's in some ways, and I am a big newspaper consumer. Like I have probably read the morning newspaper every morning of my life basically since I was probably 8 years old. Like I'm a hardcore newspaper guy. I love it. I think it's important. I think the work that you do, Eric, and people like you in local communities is really, really important. And it bothers me that although news coverage arguably is better now than it's ever been, but it's national. It's all, the number one, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I'm making this up, but the most read newspaper in California, I think, is the New York Times. And there's something wrong with that. The news business has gone national, and that's great, but gosh, there's so much like the fraternity stuff and the business dealings and the kid, at God, like that stuff is what brings communities together. And I hate to see what's happening in your industry around that.
Yeah, I think you're right about the New York Times being probably the most read newspaper in California. I think I've seen statistics of, in certain cities, the New York Times beating out the local newspaper in that city. I think that the New York Times realized a number of years ago that it was competing with all these newspapers across the country. And I don't know that the individual newspapers realized it very, very quickly, and are probably still realizing it. Like the Times-Dispatch, we are competing against the New York Times in terms of, just viewership, where people's eyes are going for news. We're competing against the Washington Post, which has 2 reporters in Richmond and can, if when something big happens, they can descend an entire team, to Richmond if they need to. And yeah, I think newspapers, little newspapers have really struggled. I know I say little, regional ones like Times-Dispatch too have really struggled, to kind of figure out like, what is our mission? How do we keep readers? And we're still struggling with that stuff today. Whereas, like the New York Times has figured out a business model and an approach, and it's really mastered it's both its business and its strategy on journalism. The rest of the newspapers, in outside of like the 3 biggest ones, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, I think everyone else is still adjusting and figuring it out. Because the business model is not the same, for the Richmond Times-Dispatch as it is for the New York Times. We have to do things differently because it just doesn't work the same way that it would for the New York Times. And so we're still trying to figure out how do we compete with the New York Times? How do we compete with the Washington Post, with our own business model that that has to do its own thing.
Yeah, well, I think you guys do a great job. I really do. Like I said, I'm an avid, since the day I moved, we've gotten the Times-Dispatch, and you've got great writers and probably not enough of them, honestly. But you've got it's really my way of staying connected to the community that I live in, and I think that's really important. And I think it might even be, probably another conversation on a more controversial topic, but it might be a part of some of the riff we have in our country today is, I think people sometimes don't feel heard. People don't feel like they're connected to a place. And so anyway, we'll save that for another day. But anyway, keep up the good work. So let's wrap up by obviously folks can find you at the paper, but like if people wanted to check out your work, like where can they do that? Like Twitter handles and all that, and also maybe a little bit about you, what you do for fun, and you're a native Richmonder, what you love about being in Richmond. So just take the mic and wrap us up with where to find you and maybe a little bit more about you.
Yeah, so Twitter is probably the best place. My handle's at Eric Kolenich. You can also find my stuff on richmond.com. If you click on my name on a story, you can see all the old content that I've written on there. And that's the best way to find my stuff. Outside of my professional life, I had a baby last year.
Nice.
We had our first child in November, so that's been a really exciting 8 months to see her grow and develop. That's what has really like filled my time the last 8 months. We like to be outdoors. We like to go hiking. My wife and I we took our baby for her first hike over the summer, and so that was an experiment, and that was interesting how that went. I'm still a big sports fan. I follow the Atlanta Braves a lot because I was a kid in Richmond when the Richmond Braves were here, and so I've been kind of latched onto the Braves ever since. But yeah, that's a little bit about me in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, we won't hold that against you. Don't be gloating about the Braves, and like it's time to end this thing, right? As a Cincinnati Reds fan, I'm happy for you, Eric. Really happy for
I
you.
mean, the Reds have some reason for hope for the future.
Well, it's been a little different summer, but we're dying on the vine. I was just texting with one of my buddies, and we're dying on the vine, I'm afraid. But anyway, Eric, this has been fantastic. I really, really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your experiences and knowledge. And I think folks are going to really enjoy this. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.